Well, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to all our online viewers, wherever you may be. My name is Russell Shao. I am the Executive Director of the Global Taiwan Institute. GTI is a 501c3 think tank dedicated exclusively to Taiwan policy research and related programs. Our mission is to enhance the relationship between the United States and Taiwan with the world by contributing to a more informed discussion about Taiwan and its people. In pursuit of that mission, we undertake several major programs. They include a biweekly publication called the Global Taiwan Brief, where we feature timely analysis and informed opinions about Taiwan. We also organize regular public seminars, like the virtual seminar that you're participating today, to discuss current developments related to Taiwan. We also organize an annual symposium in the fall where we feature practitioners and leading scholars about Taiwan policy to discuss US-Taiwan relations. We also have a podcast series, GTI Insights, where we invite journalists, activists, scholars, and experts to discuss all things related to Taiwan. In addition to these research and focus programs, we also provide scholarship as well as fellowship opportunities for people who are interested to conduct field research in Taiwan, and vice versa for Taiwanese researchers who are interested to spend a short-term fellowship here in Washington, D.C. at our office. In addition to these policy-focused programs, we also organize cultural programming as well. If you're not already subscribed to receive our updates, you may do so by visiting our website at www.globaltaiwan.org. I would be remiss if I began today's program without thanking our co-founders, our board of directors, our advisors, as well as the staff and interns who make all our programs possible. So let's begin today's program. I'm truly excited to present today's virtual seminar on Taiwan-Japan relations and their implications for the United States. During the historic summit on April 16th, just 2 months ago, US President Joe Biden and Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga took the unprecedented step of recognizing the, quote, importance of peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait, end quote. This was the first statement to explicitly include Taiwan in a summit between the two leaders since 1969. While undoubtedly momentous, the statement did not emerge from a vacuum, but is instead indicative of broader shifts in the geopolitical landscape, as well as trends in the US, Japan, and Taiwan relations. An important but relatively unexamined vector of this trilateral relationship, Taipei and Tokyo have a long and intertwined history that are both deep yet subtle. This bilateral relationship is now increasingly coming out onto the international stage. From expanding trade ties to deepening cultural affinities, shared security concerns, the two island nations have built the foundation for a strong relationship. But despite these advances, the United States has not traditionally fully grasped the strategic implications of stronger Taiwan-Japan relations. I would note that a positive recent indication of greater attention paid by Washington towards the budding Taipei and Tokyo relationship came in the appointment of the deputy director of the American Institute in Taiwan, the U.S. de facto embassy in Taiwan, as one of the future interim ambassadors to Tokyo. But for our purpose today, what are the domestic as well as external drivers of the ongoing changes in Taiwan and Japan? Moreover, what are their implications for the United States in the future of the trilateral relationship, especially in the context of the US-China strategic competition? To help us understand the historical context, regional dynamics, and the current political currents underlying the changes, we really could not have assembled a more superb lineup of experts. And I'll briefly introduce them in the order that they will be speaking. First, we have Yasuhiro Matsuda, who is a professor of international politics at the Institute for Advanced Studies on Asia at the University of Tokyo. He spent 16 years in the National Institute for Defense Studies at the Japanese Ministry of Defense, and he is also recently the author or editor of a published book called The History of Taiwan-Japan Relations 1945 to 2020, which is, I understand, currently only available in Japanese and Chinese. So hopefully his next project will be to produce an English version of this book. Next, we'll have Yizhong Lai, who is the president of the Prospect Foundation, a Taiwan-based think tank. Prior to joining the Prospect Foundation, he held several prominent positions within the current ruling Democratic Progressive Party. And most relevant to our discussion today, he also served as a special assistant in the Taiwan's representative office in Tokyo. Next, we have June Topel-Dreyer, who is a professor of political science at the University of Miami in Florida. She was formerly the Far East specialist in the Library of Congress and also served as Asia policy advisor to the Chief of Naval Operation and also as a commissioner of the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Professor Dreyer is also a member of GTI's advisory board. Next, we have Shayla Smith, who is a senior fellow for Japan Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, a true expert on Japanese politics and foreign policy, and she is the author of several books on Japanese foreign policy that I'm personally working my way through today. Last but not least, we have Kenneth Weinstein, who is the Walter P. Stern Distinguished Fellow at the Hudson Institute, and he served as the President and Chief Executive Officer of Hudson previously. Now, a note to our audience members, we will be taking questions from our live audience members, so please send them by email to contact@globaltaiwan.org or by using the chat function on our YouTube page, or you can also tweet us at Global Taiwan, and please remember to include your name as well as your affiliation. I'll repeat these instructions later on in the event. So first, I will then turn it over to Yasuhiro, who will provide us an overview about the history of Taiwan-Japan relations since he has written the book on this very topic. The virtual floor is yours, Yasuhiro.
Thank you, Russell. And dear participants and dear audience, good morning, good evening, good day anyway. And I'm Yasuhiro Matsuda, and let me briefly make an introduction about today's topic about Japan-Taiwan relations and its implication for the United States. I prepared a couple of slides. Let me share it first for saving our time. Can you see the slides? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Good. Okay. Continuity or change. This is my message today. We have witnessed a series of meetings with the United States and other nations, and we have seen the phrase such as "we underscore the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait," and it was initiated by the 2+2 meeting in the mid-March, and later on the Japan-US leaders meeting also issued the same phrase. And later, a lot of meetings followed the same phrase. I think that this is a kind of a diplomatic success of the Biden administration and also the Japanese government. But if we carefully take a look at the phrases used in the US-Japan Joint Leaders Statement, we can also see there are some differences. And also, we also have to be noted that Taiwan Strait and Taiwan are different. Some people get confused. When I see some media reports coming from, for example, Taiwan, the people might have misunderstood that Japan and the United States declared to defend Taiwan or something like that. Nothing like that. Taiwan Strait is a name of the sea, and Taiwan is another name of the land. So Sea of Japan and Japan are different, right? The English Channel and England are different. So basically, this is a diplomatic composition that both Japan and the United States underscored the importance of the peace of stability across Taiwan Strait. And Taiwan Strait is, most of the Taiwan Strait is high sea. It's an international water. So no one can, deny the importance of the peace and stability. That's the major framework. But both the United States and Taiwan support, both the United States and Japan support Taiwan in different ways. U.S. sells arms, but Japan doesn't. It supplied some vaccines, though, so they're different, right? And we also have to see encourage the peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues. We understand that this phrase was put by the Japanese, and also there is more important phrases such as the United States and Japan recognized the importance of candid conversations with China, reiterated their intention to share concerns directly, and acknowledged the need to work with China on areas of common interest. So especially compared to 2+2 statement, the Japanese leader, I think that communication with China, and also cooperation with China are very, very important. And obviously, Xi Jinping's visit to Japan, invitation is still alive. So there are some continuity and change, and which is more important? And this is my kind of a kind of a conclusion of the historical studies. When something occurs and Japan and Taiwan needs to cooperate each other, or Japan has to support Taiwan. In that occasion, China gets mad, and China pressures Japan to stop something. But in these 4 areas, basically, Japan has, pushed back China's pressure, and finally get the things done. The first, category is security of Japan, especially something which is related to Japan-US security alliance. For example, both nations have already always emphasized the peaceful solution on the Taiwan Strait through dialogue, because peace over the Taiwan Strait is so important. And Japan has set up the notion of important influence situation. Before 2015, it was called situation area surrounding Japan. So if the situation, very important situation, it means the armed attack by China to Taiwan, the Japan could support the United States by doing area support. So this also makes China very mad. But still, Japan has passed this law. And from 2005 to the present, Japan, when the situation over the Taiwan Strait is, turbulent, basically Japan has agreed with the United States to stress the importance of the peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait. So in the future, maybe both nations will enhance the alliance system. The second category is sovereignty. For example, who visits Japan? It is the matter of, Japan's sovereignty. For example, Lee Teng-hui once wanted to visit Japan after his resignation. But still, China, opposed it very much. And there are many cases like that. But Japan finally accepted Lee Teng-hui's visit. So I think that who visits Japan is a category of Japan's, sovereignty. So this is also, a category that, Japan can resist against China's pressure. The third category is economic and social. For example, China's entrance to China's staying in the Asian Development Bank, Japan helped a lot. And also, Japan supported Taiwan's participation in APEC and WTO. And also, Japan signed an agreement on fishery issues with Taiwan in 2013. These are all things that China don't like. But still we did it because in Japan's definition, Japan-Taiwan relation is the unofficial relations with cultural and economic characteristics. So in this field, China has no right to stop Japan. And the last category is humanitarian. For example, in 1999, Japan dispatched an emergency assistance unit on earthquake. And Japan was the first country to send this unit. And China at that time didn't blame Japan, but thanked Japan because Japan helped Taiwan as a part of China. But anyway, China was not that pleasant, but still, Japan did it. And Li Tenhui's visit to Japan for his heart surgery. This is also a humanitarian issue. And also, Japan is supporting Taiwan's participation in WHA since 2003. This is also a humanitarian and also a global health issue. And vaccine support to Taiwan just recently occurred. These are all, items which Japan can resist China's pressures. So what would happen in the future? I listed in the right side, but because of the time, I will make a conclusion here. Continuity or change? My answer is yes, depends on no. So there are different answers. And I see continuity is much more or much bigger than change. For example, yes, further enhancement of Japan-US alliance. I think that we will see the further enhancement. I think that Japan is poised to do this, but and also support for the Taiwan's participation in WHA. I think that Japan will continue to do so, but there are something depends. Taiwan's participation in CPTPP or Japan-Taiwan FTA. I think that this is still conditional. And I think that Taiwan also has to make great effort, especially for lifting the food import ban of Japan and so on. So and besides that, there are a lot of items to deal with. I think that Taiwan's participation into the free trade agreement is very, very, the bar is very high. And no, or takes very long time, is, for example, high-level visits. Japan's high-level visits, maybe the vice minister has visited officially to Taiwan once, but the second time is very difficult. Japan still needs stable relation with China. So I think that maybe former Prime Minister Abe may be visiting Taiwan, but he is not a current prime minister. So it's a different calculation. And Japan-Taiwan security ties, I think that it will take very long time, maybe decades. I think that Japan and Taiwan should do more, the confidence building first. Japan is pledged to do the enhancement of the Japan-US alliance, but it does not necessarily mean that Japan is stepping into the direct, security ties with Taiwan. So I think that US may or can or should, it depends different for different people. support Japan's no list or depend list. For example, if Japan and Taiwan have difficulties to have direct link in the defense field, the United States can have a kind of a bridge, play the role of the bridge between Japan and Taiwan, such as Japan and South Korea did in the past. So US can make a kind of a mediation between Japan and Taiwan in some fields. So this is my conclusion, and these two books are books. So if you read Japanese or Chinese, I would be I would appreciate you if you take a look at them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Matsuda. And again, we're happy to promote your books for you. And certainly for your very lawyerly conclusion in hedging on depends with your conclusion. I particularly like the how you laid out all the different actions taken by Japan in support of Taiwan in different areas of categories, so we can sort of clearly distinguish what buckets they are and how Japan justifies them in its ties with Taiwan. And I think I take your point in terms of the sort of nuanced distinction between the statement's inclusion of Taiwan Strait versus specifically referring to Taiwan itself necessarily. And I think that distinction is something that we could unpack a bit more in our discussions later. So next, I'd like to turn it over to Ito Lai, who will give us a Taiwanese perspective on these issues. Ito, the virtual floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Russell, and thanks for the GTI for inviting me to be in this very important and very fruitful discussion, I expect. I will just provide the Taiwanese perspective regarding the Taiwan-Japan relation and Taiwan-Japan-US relationship. First of all, just a quick intervention into what the Matsuda, his statement trying to make a distinction between Taiwan Strait and Taiwan, just makes me wonder that if the China attacked Taiwan from the eastern side, so that means that that is not in the peace and stability of the Taiwan Straits. So what will happen then? This is just my question there, but probably later on we can discuss. But going back to the issue that the Taiwan-Japan relations, I think historically that the people all know that in 1972, before 1972, Japan has the official relation with Taiwan, and then after that, Japan switched tie to a PRC. But in terms of the relationship within Taiwan, it also has its domestic dimension. That is, Taiwan was formerly a colony of Japan, and the KMT came to Taiwan due to the February 228 massacres. It started to back into the domestic audience, Taiwanese public here. They tended to compare the rule under the Japan and rule under the KMT, and they always came up with the conclusion that it was more humane when the Taiwan was under the Japan's rule. And that brings up the issue and intertwined with the Taiwanese domestic identity politics. So that the KMT, especially their experience in China in fighting against Japan invasion, and with that historical memory to Taiwan, sometimes that directly in conflict with the domestic, their more favorable appreciation of Japan, so that when they started to talk about Taiwan-Japan relation on certain levels, it come out with the statement many times had been bragged about what was doing, what Japan did to China about during the World War II times. So that's how the complication within Taiwan when they talk about Japan-Taiwan relations. Many times it was just intertwined with the domestic identity politics. And of course, in turn, an overall situation that Japan was one of the Taiwan very important trade partners, and after 1972 and forward, Japan also provides many of the necessary technological advancement for Taiwan to upgrade its own industries. But on the other hand, that Japan-Taiwan relations, while it was conducted, I have to say that before the Lee Teng-hui came in, the perspective from Taiwan government to Japan, basically it is the extension of the China-Japan relations after the 1945. And that basically was how their view, and then they conducted Japan-Taiwan relations. And I remember one time, one former Taiwan representative to Japan, he was advocating that the ROC government was so generous to Japan, so that he wants to remind Japanese people how the ROC is returning the morality toward the instead of the hatred toward Japan, trying to incite Japan's their own reciprocity toward Taiwan. That is before 1988. That time that some of the Taiwan's foreign policy exercise toward Japan that was doing that time. But then when the Lee Teng-hui came, I think associated with it is some of the Taiwanese perspective about what Japan, especially before 1945, the Japan-Taiwan relation that started to become one of the key elements in terms of how to upgrade and try to treat it Japan-Taiwan relation through that angles. And that started to bear fruit. And also at that time that during the 90s, Taiwan was in the process of democratizations, which makes the Japan government and Japan's political elites to discover that Taiwan is one of its neighbors sharing the same political values, which started to register within the Japan political elites about the uniqueness of Taiwan. But I think when year 2000 DPP came into power, one of the very important transformation that DPP did to transform the Taiwan-Japan relation is that the DPP wanted to transform this whole relationship, particularly through the value of democracy. And through that, they started to consciously change some of their past practices toward Japan. For example, about the Yasukuni visit, Yasukuni Shrine's visit, about the historical textbook issues. And DPP government consciously wanted to inject it. Since Taiwan-Japan both are a democracy, and it is important in trust of the democracy, we should let the Japanese society to decide what the issue should be talked about. And the DPP at that time also emphasized about the post-war Japan as a peaceful countries, and so that before the World War II, the militaristic, the kind of the experiences, DPP no longer hold that against Japan. So I think that systematic transformation about how to view Japan started to register and dominated later on, about at least some through a DPP government, and also injected some of its element into some part of the KMT's practices toward Japan. And that is another important, in my view, that another value that about the Taiwan-Japan relation transformed. But another thing about the Taiwan-Japan relation at that time that DPP wanted to do is to look at Taiwan-Japan relation not in terms of Taiwan-Japan-China triangular relations, but try to inject how the Taiwan-Japan relation could see through the Taiwan-Japan and US, the trilateral relationship. Because the DPP government at that time believed that these triangular relations is the positive sum. It's not a zero-sum relation, whether that's a US-Taiwan-China or the US-Japan-Taiwan-China relationship. And since all three countries share the same political values and also have a very similar national interest. And DPP at that time also believed that in order to face the Chinese security challenges, how to integrate Taiwan into the US-Japan security system, that is very important things to do. And so that they wanted to see how the improvement of Taiwan-Japan relation can be through the US-Japan alliance system, and trying to engage Japan in that particular angles. And so that under the DPP government, I think also later on from subsequent KMT government, the enterprise or the initiative of the Taiwan-Japan-US Trilateral dialogue that started to develop and start to register among the security establishment about how those things goes. Of course, sometimes people take this as a trilateral relations. Sometimes people wanted to put this as a bilateral relation between Taiwan and the US-Japan alliances because they wanted to register how Taiwan can be a part or a part of the calculation within the US-Japan security systems. With the effort like this has various degree of success or challenges, but at least right now it seems the route about the deepening the Taiwan-Japan-US relationship that has the wider acceptance within the Taiwan and also within the United States as well as Japan for that particular development. And of course, I think associated with the United States, the policy changes about China after the year 2017 and onward, the US-Japan-Taiwan, the trilateral dialogue and trilateral relationship take a more prominent role in registering or facing how to deal with China. And we also witnessed that this year, the Biden administrations also transform the traditional, the U.S., Taiwan, China, the trilateral relation in terms of Taiwan Strait security by inviting other players, including Japan, even Australia, and the European countries, G7 countries, to be a part of these Taiwan Strait security calculations. And so that to a certain extent, I believe how the Taiwan-Japan-US, the trilateral security development and how these things can move forward, probably we could see that, take that as template to predict or project how the Taiwan-US, for example, the Australia and other different players when they're about their involvement in the Taiwan Strait security calculations. And later on, we also witnessed that the Japan's own initiative in terms of how the Japan EU and Japan Australia, without the United States, but the Japan come out and register how the importance of the Taiwan Strait security is to Japan. So that those are the very, very recent development and how the Japan is not just a part of the US ally system, but also has a security calculation of its own about Taiwan. That's one of the very different development now in comparison with like things happened 5 or 6 years ago. And so I think when we talk about those Taiwan-Japan relations, the past paradigm in the last 20 years probably won't be able to project or to cover the very different nature and the depth about how the Japan's involvement in the security about Taiwan. So I just stop here. Thank you very much.
You know, that's excellent. And while it's unfortunate that we're unable to see you due to low bandwidth issues, but I think you came through loud and clear there. And I thought that, you know, your detailed explanation of domestic drivers for changes in Taiwan's relations with Japan is particularly noteworthy. And I thought it was interesting how you highlighted that. And in fact, that there is a sort of autonomous component to Japanese policy towards Taiwan. And I think that's probably a really good segue now over to Shayla, who will then cover where Japanese politics are now and how the issue of Taiwan and its defenses are being discussed in Japan. Shayla, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Russell, and thank you to GTI for inviting me. I am delighted to see everyone, especially Matsuda-san, who I haven't seen in a couple of years now, given the pandemic. So it's nice to see you. Let me say first and foremost, I'm learning a lot. In the previous presentations, I've been writing notes copiously, but I think my task, Russell, is to talk a little bit about the politics or the political situation in Japan that might shape not only Japan-Taiwan relations, but also, as Ichi and I was talking about, this effort to trilateralize the US-Japan-Taiwan relationship. So let me share with you some thoughts. I think there's been significant changes. So I'm going to take, so Matsuda-san took the continuity side. I'll take you a little bit down the change side. And let me do that through 3 things that I think are important as we look at the internal debate inside Japan on this. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the LDP, where most of the debates over Taiwan policy have been held, public opinion, and then the business economic component, which of course we can't leave out of the political consideration. And then I'll conclude with a few remarks about the alliance, US-Japan and Taiwan piece. So traditionally the LDP has organized itself around the China versus Taiwan divide, and this of course comes out of the 1972 normalization, but it's important to understand that it's also been tied historically to the factions inside the LDP. There are certain factions that are noted as pro-China, certain factions pro-Taiwan. And you go back to Abe Shinzo's grandfather, Kishinobusuke, as prime minister, made his first overseas trip to Taiwan in 1957. So you've got some continuity here in some of the contemporary players inside the LDP that's important to note. But of course, the two factions that were known to be most active in the normalization talks and interested in improving relations with the mainland, of course, were the Tanaka faction and the Ohira faction that came afterwards. And those two people, the descendants and the inheritors of those two factions, continue to be active today. The Li Denghui visit in 2000 came up in the earlier conversation. It's interesting that Li Denghui has a very particular relationship with Japan, his own personal history, as well as the way in which the LDP, or the conservative political elites in Japan, treated him, is not necessarily indicative of Japan's policy on Taiwan, but it's an important factor. And there you had a little bit of that tension between some of the players inside the LDP. At the time, the foreign minister was Kono Yohei, who of course is the father of Kono Taro, who did not want to approve the visit, but he was overridden by the prime minister at the time, Mr. Mori, who is much more sympathetic to the Taiwan-Japan relationship and to President Lee himself. But I think you've got much more blurring of the lines of this factional division on this question of Japan's interests. And I think it's important to understand the next generation of leadership, even those who are attached to, for example, the parliamentary leagues, the friendship leagues, their lines are a little bit more blurred as well. We have this new project team that many of you know about that was formed in the wake of President Biden's inauguration. So this is a project team that was formed inside the LDP, led by a Diet member, Sato Masahiro, who is well known to many of the US-Japan Alliance folks as somebody who came out of the self-defense forces, who is very strong on the defense issues discussed inside the LDP, and he's now the director of the Foreign Affairs Division of the party. So Sato has been put in charge of this project team on Taiwan. It was formed on February 10th. They've already made some recommendations for how to move forward in Japan's relationship with Taiwan, and of course on some of these very important alliance issues. So I think this also reflects a shift, not just the factional shift. Sato himself is from a faction that has traditionally been known to be more favorable to China, the Takeshita faction. But I think what you're seeing in the membership of that project team and on the agenda that they laid out for the discussion is not a China versus Taiwan alignment, but rather a national security foreign policy alignment of Japan, which again backs up Lee Chang-lai's comment about Japan's autonomous view on the importance of Taiwan to its own strategic thinking. So to share some of the conclusions of that report, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it focuses an awful lot on what the universal values that Japan and Taiwan share, the way in which Japan ought to support Taiwan in its position in the international community. So of course it goes over issues that have already been discussed. So Taiwan's participation in TPP, Taiwan's role in the free and open Indo-Pacific concept that Japan is very strongly supporting in the region. It talks about coordinating more closely with the United States on a variety of policy changes, including referencing the adaptation to our Taiwan Relations Act of 2018, which allows more high-level visits. So again, they put that on the table to be studied. And of course, on the defense side, the contingency planning, the way in which some kind of military crisis might affect Japan. So that's the agenda of the team, that not everything has been concluded. There's some recommendations at the end, but there really is, the overall gist of that report is really to put on the table the two things that both Matsuda Sensei and Lee Chang-lai put out there for us. One is Japan's autonomous interest in its relationship with Taiwan, but the other is how to weave Japan's Taiwan policy in coordination with the United States and Taipei into a stronger trilateral coordination. So I think the LDP has lost some of the old factional kind of separation. I think you're seeing a much more pragmatic look at Taiwan-Japan relations as a strategic priority. So that's important inside the LDP. The second place we look at the political context within which this is being debated in Japan, of course, is we have to think about the Japanese public, how they view this issue and how they may or may not respond to any kind of an initiative to change policy. Largely, we've got some very good polling data on Japanese attitudes towards China. I couldn't, in preparation for this, I couldn't come up with any long longitudinal studies that were specific to Taiwan. But I think you also have to, I think seeing this partly through the gaze of how Japanese attitudes towards China continue to be skeptical. 89% of the Japanese, almost 90% of Japanese polled by Genron, which does these long decades of longitudinal polling on public attitudes towards China. So that's a 2020 number, is 89% of the Japanese have unfavorable attitudes towards China. And many, when you break that down further, it goes into the reasons why. The worry on the defense side, though, I thought was very interesting in the 2020 results, because they looked at the threat perception, and North Korea still ranks higher than China in terms of immediate military threat. But the threat is largely organized around perceptions of something happening in the Senkaku Islands as opposed to a Taiwan scenario. And so we're still not at the point where you see the Japanese public responding to the idea that there may be some kind of critical issue in Taiwan. But given that we don't have actual polling data on Japanese attitudes towards Taiwan, what I thought I would emphasize here is something that you hear frequently, and this audience, of course, will know well, is that Taiwan has a very high favorability rate. When you do, which countries do you like the most? Taiwan always ranks fairly high in the Japanese among the Japanese public, and in particular because of Taiwan's response to the 2011 earthquake, and its assistance and openness to Japan in conversation over the management of COVID and vaccines. So you have a fairly high degree of Japanese public sense that Taiwan is a close friend and a partner. And so that, I think, is something that gives you another sort of recalibration, not on the threat side, but on the friendship side between Japan and Taiwan. The other place where I think you'll see the public attitudes in Japan have changed considerably, and that is on defense preparedness, in the sense that Japan needs to do more for its own defenses. When you look at polling data, irrespective of what country the threat may be perceived as emanating from, the Japanese public are far more ready for steps to enhance Japanese defenses than they might have been a decade or so ago. So you've got a Japanese public that's very attuned to the shifts, the strategic shifts, in particular in proximity to Japan in the East China Sea. And again, here, I don't see much evidence that the Taiwan contingent, we'll have to wait a bit to see what public attitudes are, especially this year, since we've got this very high profile conversation after the Biden-Suga summit about Taiwan. But most of that is directed towards the Senkakus and East China Sea concerns. Let me end my sweep of the Japanese political landscape by talking a little bit about economics and where business and economic elites may come down on this. Again, we don't have concrete data yet, and it's a bit early to see where the economic elites may be seeing the current conversation about coordination on Taiwan with the United States. But, you know, just to give you a frame here, China trade totals about $331 billion for Japan. It's its largest trading partner. In contrast, the trade with Taiwan is about 70 billion. So it's, by magnitude, it's not as large, and therefore you don't have I went to look for statements by Keidanren or Keizai Doyukai or the big business elites and where Taiwan may factor in there. There's virtually no mention of Taiwan. That doesn't mean that Taiwan trade is not important or that the economic component of the relationship is not important, but it doesn't factor yet in the business elites' commentary on foreign policy. Where you do see it, and you see it in this project team's report, is a new emphasis. And I hear this when I talk to business elites anecdotally, and that's an emphasis on economic security. There is a much more higher degree of sensitivity about supply chain dynamics. And of course, that engages Taiwan immediately, right? And also about things that affect democracies, things about the digital free flow of data. Those kinds of topics are areas where in private conversations, I hear Japanese corporations talk a little bit more about new ways in which they can engage in conversation with Taipei. And of course, there's this whole question that Matsuda-san seems a little bit more pessimistic on, which is the opportunity for a free trade agreement with Taiwan. I don't have any judgment about the political support for that. It may be that the Chinese response to something like that may factor in as far as the business elites are thinking. But I don't know. I think it's a little early to know whether or not that'll get public support or public caution. So let me conclude with a couple of comments on the US-Japan piece of this. We are in a pretty dynamic year in terms of our policy conversation about weaving this trilateral policy dialogue into something more concrete. We had the 2+2 earlier this year that began the conversation. We'll have another 2+2, we expect, before year's end. There's already been a suggestion in the public sphere, at least, that perhaps the time has come to look at revising the US-Japan Defense Cooperation Guidelines. For those of you who are not defense alliance nerds like me, this is the kind of regular consultative process and then the product of that process between the United States and Japan. And that's what the alliance, professionals get together, they think about new questions about force posture, about operations, about how we can up the game in terms of our defense alliance coordination, but it's very specific to the military side of things. So if guidelines revision is put forward as the process by which we incorporate a Taiwan contingency, that will be a pretty large signal in my mind. That the contingency planning piece of our thinking about a Taiwan situation has moved forward considerably. So keep your eyes on that. On the diplomatic strategy, I think we're already seeing this, and Matsuda-san and Lee Chang-lai already mentioned this, but I think you're seeing considerable diplomatic success. You saw it at the G7. You saw not only the language that Matsuda-san quoted, but you also see more engagement by other actors in the same direction that Japan and the United States are trying to move this dialogue with Taiwan. So you've got it incorporated into Indo-Pacific agenda building. You've got it incorporated now with the European Union and the G7. I think these are a lot of very good venues to up our diplomatic game to make sure that the costs of any kind of coercion on the part of Beijing become much more obvious there. So that's a very important piece, and I think it's a very almost more than the bilateral or trilateral. I think this diplomatic strategy to get Taiwan elevated in this other conversation around the globe is very important. And then let me conclude on the last piece, which is Japan's own politics will, of course, be in the mix here. There's an election coming. An important election for Prime Minister Suga, because of course Japan is having a very tough summer with the Olympics and the COVID response. Suga-san and the LDP will be at the polls in October. So anything that comes out on the Taiwan piece will come out after that, is safely behind the LDP. So I don't expect to see a lot of public conversation. I expect to see a lot of quiet alliance dialogue and no shifts until the Japanese government gets past this electoral cycle. And then we'll see at the end of the day how much energy there can be dedicated towards alliance upgrading and this particular Taiwan piece. So let me end there. Thank you very much for having me.
Shayla, that was really perfect. Precisely what I had hoped for and expected from you. And I really can't recommend enough for our audience members, Shayla's book, Intimate Rivals, Japanese Domestic Politics and a Rising China, that she published it back in 2005. And just from your remarks right now, I can envision a follow-on project, perhaps on Japanese domestic politics in Taiwan, right? That is a really fascinating account of the factional and politics and domestic constituencies for Japanese foreign policy as it relates to China and Taiwan. So next, I'm going to turn it over to GTI's advisor, June Topel-Dreyer, who will provide a U.S. perspective on the significance or lack of significance in traditional views about Taiwan-Japan relations and the current dynamics of those relations. June, over to you.
Okay, hi Russell, and thank you for having me here. You've given me the task, and I wrote it down very carefully here. U.S. perspective on the significance or lack thereof on traditional views about the Taiwan-Japan relationship and the current dynamics of those relations, which fits in very nicely with the continuity and change we've been talking about here. And absolutely, there has been continuity in U.S. policy ab initio, and it's been that any solution to what they persist in calling the Taiwan question, I would prefer to see it called the China question, is it has to be peaceful and acceptable to people on both sides. Now, here's the rub, and that is this sounds very nice in theory, but when it has been the consistent policy of the other side of the Taiwan Strait, i.e. the People's Republic of China, that the only solution to what it maddeningly calls reunification is by force if necessary. And when the party and the government have indoctrinated their people for 75, 80 years now with the idea that Taiwan really was once part of China, the theory doesn't sound as practical anymore, because you will never get one side of the Taiwan Strait saying we're agreeing to one country, two systems, or we're agreeing to one Taiwan and one China. So that means that the US consistent policy is not going to work, okay? And back in the era of Chiang Kai-shek and Jiang Jingguo, at least the government of the Republic of China, then on Taiwan, but not necessarily the people of Taiwan, could say, yes, we want unification. And the only question back then was unification under whom? Would it be the KMT or would it be the CCP? With the coming of democracy, more and more residents of Taiwan, be they Banshanren or Waishanren, made it clear that they did not want unification. And a very good friend of mine has suggested we just dump the idea of unification and call it what it is, which is annexation. And I happen to agree with that. So anyway, here we have the Taiwan Relations Act, which gives the United States government a legislatively mandated role in peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, euphemism obviously for keeping China from invading Taiwan. It's only logical that the United States seeks international support. If no allies, then at least like-minded partners. And here, Japan is the most logical of these because of its strategic location. In other words, as we would say in the American South, it has a dog in the fight, okay? And Yonaguni, the southernmost island of, well, we can quibble about Okinotori, can't we? But anyway, Yonaguni is the southernmost island. It's only about 60 miles from Taiwan. So if China did manage to annex Taiwan, it would put China's territorial waters smack up against the Japan, which is already skittish about Chinese maritime patrols through the Bolster Channel that passes by Taiwan's Orchid Island and into the Philippines. And by the way, somebody mentioned the strategic location before with the security relationship. The Bolster Channel happens to be the location of several very important undersea cables that carry data among all Asian nations. And there was a major disruption back in December 2006. Nobody appears to remember this anymore, that disrupted communications for several weeks. Now, that one was naturally occurring. There was a typhoon. So you can imagine if the Chinese government should seek to interdict that. Now, it is an international waterway, as I believe it was Matsuda Sensei mentioned before. There's nothing we can do about that, but you can bet that the Japanese government is very concerned with the increasing passage of Chinese ships through that strait, and it would be very easy to disrupt communication again. And then again, there's a lot of concern with the increasing Chinese passage of Chinese ships through the Miyako Strait, which runs between Miyako Island, obviously Japanese, and Okinawa, obviously Japanese. And so now, if you look at this from the Chinese point of view, and they've said this several times, there have been several articles in Guofang, which means defense, in Chinese military analysts, and they're saying that Taiwan is the buckle in the belt that is restraining the Chinese Navy from breaking into the open Pacific. And of course, if you look at, that's the Chinese perspective. If you look at it from the point of view of the Japanese and the Americans, that buckle, meaning Taiwan, is a restraint on Chinese expansionism. So obviously, United States and Japan have a common interest in protecting Taiwan from annexation. The problem for the United States, and I'm looking at it as Russell mandated here, from the American perspective, is just getting the Japanese to do something about this, make a commitment. Matsuda-san, you correctly mentioned the waters around the area, the Shuhenji-tai, and we, the United States, have been nudging, pushing Japan on the Shuhenji-tai for the longest time. And what we find both delightful and maddening about our relationship with Japan is the ability of the Japanese language to be ambiguous in places where we wish it weren't ambiguous, okay? And here that I see Shayla smiling, and you can see I talk a lot to American military people about this, and they have been tearing what is left of their hair out of this for the longest time. Now, both sides, I think, agreed that Taiwan might be too provocative toward China under Chen Shui-bian. I'm a big Chen Shui-bian fan, so I'm not going to tell them I agree with that. But in any case, they were very nervous about that. And then, however, under Ma Ying-jeou, they then started to be nervous in the other direction, that Ma Ying-jeou was undermining gradually Taiwan's resistance to decide its own future by making all these economic pacts that increased Taiwan's dependence on China. And as part of courting China, which he did vigorously, Ma was very cool, even rude toward Japan. And he was genuinely insulting toward Abe Shinzo when Abe Shinzo visited. I mean, kind of horrifyingly so. And then he was also very rude to the Japanese representative to Taiwan at the time, Sato Masaaki, for having the nerve to say that talking privately, by the way, that that the issue of Taiwan, whether it belonged to China or not, was not resolved. Now, Sato was absolutely right, but he managed to make him, Ma managed to make him so miserable, he eventually resigned. And so, in any case, the United States and Japan were both pleased with the Sunflower Movement. You know, finally somebody is saying no to Ma, this is a step too far, and a little apprehensive about what Tsai Ing-wen might be provocative, since she belonged to the same political party. She and Chen are very different personalities, as all of us who know them know, and she has been absolutely the opposite of provocative. In fact, according to some of her more extreme supporters, not provocative enough. But in any case, certainly acceptable to the United States in her level of cool competence toward the issue. And Taiwan-Japan relations improved instantly after her election, even with Abe sending her congratulations, which that had not happened since 1972, that the Japanese government had congratulated. So that was definitely a symbolic, I don't know, straw in the wind or something like that. And then there was the changing of the name of the this Japan called it this clunky interchange organization. You know, what the heck does that mean? And so it was changed to Taiwan-Japan Exchange Organization, and then Taiwan reciprocated a couple of months later by setting up the Taiwan-Japan Relations Organization. And again, very symbolic, because this implies equality between the two sides. And that, I think, goes back to Professor Matsuda's comment about sovereignty and the issue of the importance of sovereignty. So symbolically, you're saying there, nothing's changed, but everything's changed, because there is that implication of equality here. And I'm skipping over a lot. I wrote down some scribbly notes yesterday about things to say, and I'm saying I'm not going to have time to say half of them. But then there was that 2017 NIDS report on Taiwan, which upset the Chinese government, because among other horrors, it described, it referred to twice to the Republic of China. Oh my God, the Republic of China never existed. We can't mention that. Even though the NIDS report was talking about a time when the Japanese government recognized the Republic of China. So a lot of stuff like that. And somebody's mentioned, in fact, several of you mentioned sending emergency supplies after natural disasters like earthquakes and typhoons. And naturally, this is humanitarian, as Professor Matsuda mentioned, but you know, it's humanitarian with a zingy spike in it. Because what day did those emergency supplies arrive? Don't all answer at once. June 4th. Yes, it could have been an accident, but you know, come on, guys. This is a government who, when they were particularly pissed off, pardon me expression, with China, Prime Minister Abe got in an airplane whose numbers on the side, Shayla, you know what I'm going to say, were 731, the name of the infamous biological warfare people. So I don't think June 4th was an accident. And then, of course, 3 days later, since I'm going to get back to the Trilateral here, 3 days later, or maybe it was 2 days later, a plane arrives from the United States, and it was a military aircraft carrying 3 senators and more vaccine. And oh, I should have mentioned that according to the Taiwan press, that Japanese plane that landed with the vaccine on June 4th was accompanied by an American military plane. So you're seeing here this very dance. I was going to say a very subtle dance, but I think if you're Japanese and they're very attuned to subtlety, it's not a very subtle dance. It's a pretty obvious dance. And then there are also various trilateral partnerships set up, like the Taiwan US-Japan Global Cooperation and Training Framework. And this meets yearly, and it discusses various problems. And then the 3 also participated with Sweden in a cybersecurity conference held in Taiwan. And remember, theoretically, Taiwan doesn't exist. So Sweden attending was very important. Sweden, as those of you who follow the Chinese press know, Sweden has had its own problems. They have a very assertive Chinese ambassador, the wolf warrior of all wolf warriors. And I can only think that was symbolic as well. And then there is an annual US-Taiwan-Japan Trilateral Indo-Pacific Security Dialogue. I think the last one was December 2020. Presumably, hopefully, there'll be another one December 2021. Now, none of this is below China's notice. What they've been trying here is they have to be careful. I mean, for all of this yelling and the wealth warrior stuff, they know they have to be careful. You cited the latest Genron poll. There's a Pew poll, Shayla, that says pretty much the same thing. But the Chinese government has to know that since relations between the United States and China are awful, being too harsh on Japan might push Japan closer to the United States, which has been a long-term worry for Beijing. And the party line has been pushing that all this is a small group of ultra-conservatives in Japan who are, and this exact quote from the Chinese newspaper, playing with fire on Taiwan, making wild bets on Taiwan, and trying to play a Taiwan card. And that what this is, to go back to Professor Masaru on sovereignty, what these small group of conservatives are doing is selling out Japan's sovereignty to the Americans. And that Suga is trying to create an image as a tough guy in order to boost his public support ratings ahead of the election Shayla has just told us is about to happen. And they've been explicitly warned that if Japan participates with the United States in a Taiwan contingency, the US bases on Taiwan will be attacked. Now, my concluding word here, where is all this going? Although there are surely Japanese saying that Japan shouldn't under any circumstances get involved in a US-China confrontation scenario about Taiwan or anything else. This is what I call the poor little us caught in the middle scenario, which, as you can tell from the way I've worded it, bothers me. The general drift appears to be in Japan toward a harder line on joining in with the United States on protecting Taiwan. And at the end of May, a retired GSDS officer described Taiwan. He said, a Taiwan emergency is a Japan emergency. There's no way of getting around this. Taiwan is not that far from the Senkaku and the Diaoyu Islands. And what the United States and Japan need to do is develop a deterrent credible enough to convince China that an armed confrontation would be unproductive and irrational. And you see the same thing, and I think, Sheila, you mentioned this, the LDP Foreign Affairs Division the other day proposed updates to the US-Japan defense guidelines that were focused on contingencies in the Taiwan Strait. So my last sentence here, realizing that the future is unpredictable, right now, it seems to me as if the trend is toward closer US-Japan-Taiwan cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I think you ended on the perfect note there. And for us to transition now over to Ken, and I think your point about that while U.S. approach to Japan and Taiwan have been continuous, that approach may not necessarily be sustainable in the longer term. I think you laid out a compelling set of cases for why you think that is the case. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Ken and to give us where he sees the future of U.S. Taiwan and Japan relations going forward. Ken, forward.
Great, thank you, Russell, and thank you, GTI. I'm delighted to be here with this very distinguished panel. I've learned a lot from my colleagues on this panel over the years, so it's an honor, a bit daunting to be speaking alongside them at this very timely discussion. I'm going to offer my perspective on the future of the Taiwan-Japan bilateral relationship with the notion, of course, as has been noted earlier, that the Taiwan-Japan relationship has to be understood within the broader context of the US-Japan-Taiwan trilateral relationship. Discussion of the future is speculative, but we're, I think, already seeing the outline of what I would call the new US-Japan-Taiwan trilateral relationship, which has very deep implications for the Japan-Taiwan bilateral relationship. Let me note, first of all, that the US-Taiwan-Japan trilateral relationship is an increasingly a critical relationship between three democratic peoples at the forefront of technological development, three critical voices for freedom at home and human rights abroad. And we've seen a shift in Japan in recent months on this topic with regard to PRC actions, and also has been noted for free and open Indo-Pacific, whether through FOIP in the US, free and open Indo-Pacific in the US, through FOIP in Japan, or through Taiwan's southbound policy. Point number two, this trilateral relationship was always central for Taiwan, as Taiwan's security largely depended on the US and on the presence of US forces in Japan, and because, as been noted, the deep historical mutual goodwill between the people of Taiwan and the people of Japan. This intertwined web of relationships is increasingly key, not just for Taiwan, but also now for the US and Japan as well. Not simply because of our dedication to the defense of a critical democracy, the only liberal democracy in the Sinophone world, but also because Taiwan is the focal point for First Island chain defense, critical to Japan's national security and the maintenance of the American security umbrella and deterrent in the Indo-Pacific, critical to both the US and Japan. For the US and Japan, Taiwan isn't only a flourishing democracy, it's the canary in the coal mine for Beijing's expansionist ambitions. That being said, my third point, moving forward, the evolution of both the bilateral Taiwan-Japan relationship and the broader trilateral relationship are likely to be driven more by the actions of the PRC than anything else. It was the PLA's, the People Liberation Army, growing prowess at sea and in the air, Beijing's increasingly visible hegemonic ambitions in the South and East China Seas, its aggressive crackdowns in Hong Kong, as well as Xi Jinping's blunt call for reunification with Taiwan, describing it as central to the rejuvenation of the Chinese people, that brought Taiwan and Japan into this new stage of the relationship. And it was China's deceptions about the outbreak of COVID, its heavy-handed attempt to exclude Taiwan from international bodies, including the World Health Assembly, and its efforts to try to deny Taiwan the vaccines it needs, that has led to a transformation of the bilateral Taiwan-Japan relationship. This relationship, of course, takes place within the balancing act, as was noted, of the Japan-China relationship, which is critical in some sense to large segments of the Japanese business community. Point four, thanks to Beijing's menacing behavior and bullying, in some sense, we no longer treat Taiwan as if it were a family member we are somehow embarrassed to be seen with out in public. And this is, and here I think it's important to note that President Tsai deserved huge credit for seizing on this opportunity to transform Taiwan's role on the world stage. But major credits also due the Trump administration first, and also the Biden administration, and both the Abe and now the Suga government, in treating Taiwan as it deserves to be treated, as a respected and valued member of the international community. And that is not going to change anytime soon. Whether it was President Trump receiving President Tsai's call during the 2016 transition, whether it was Secretary Pompeo lifting the ban on having Taiwanese officials visit the State Department and our facilities, whether it was Ambassador Shelby Kim being invited and attending the Biden-Harris inauguration, the U.S. has made great strides in treating Taiwan as it deserves. Also note the important visit by Secretary Azar to Taipei. Japan has made major strides as well, with Prime Minister Abe tweeting back and forth with President Tsai, congratulating her on her re-election. Prime Minister Suga naming a great friend of Taiwan, Nobuo Kishi, as a defense minister. I remember chatting with him actually at the 2016 inauguration in Taipei when he headed Japan's delegation there. The donation of the COVID vaccines marks another important step forward. Between these actions and the references to peace and stability in the Taiwan Straits at the US-Japan Summit and the G7, it's clear that Taiwan is no longer a pariah on the international stage, which Beijing had attempted, and in large part had succeeded in some ways in doing. It was especially wonderful to see high-ranking EU officials such as Commission President von der Leyen praise Taiwan publicly as the EU scrambled for PPE at the height of the pandemic. Let me know my fifth point. These recent actions are critical, but they're just the beginning of a new era for Taiwan on the international stage. We've seen the US, Japan, and Australia band together to coordinate development assistance to Pacific Island nations that are Taiwan's diplomatic allies, offering critical support to Palau through an undersea cable to keep it out of the Chinese infosphere. We've seen cooperation on development projects as well in Latin America with Taiwan's diplomatic allies. We all need to do more to give Taiwan the role it deserves on the international community, including obviously at the World Health Assembly, working hard to counter the PRC's full court press to keep Taiwan out of these agencies. That being said, my sixth point, the US and Japan can and should do more to ensure Taiwan's security. Strong steps are already being taken in this direction. The long overdue sale of the 66 F-16s to Taiwan, finalized last year, is one step. We need to do a lot more. But to do more, and particularly in the Taiwan-Japan context, I think Japanese public opinion needs to be prepared more on the question of the Taiwan contingency. Shayla made reference to the unfavorability of China in Japan, largely due to the Senkaku's question. Now I think it is time to really bring, to have public defense intellectuals in Japan, to bring scenarios of a possible PRC invasion or blockade of Taiwan into the public debate in Japan, so the Japanese public itself can grapple with the question of whether or not the current state of coordination with Taiwan, done at the university, think tank, and retired former official level, is sufficient to the kinds of contingencies Japan and Taiwan face. My strong belief is that once the people of Taiwan realize how the current state of affairs endangers not only Taiwan, but also Japan, there'll be greater pressure to do more in this area. The retired chief of staff of the Japanese Joint Chiefs, Admiral Kawano, said it best, quote, Japan should have a stronger sense of ownership, unquote, in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, given the proximity of the Taiwan Strait to Japan. 8, in addition to educating the public, I'd argue it's also time to educate the PRC and the PLA by sharing in some manner joint contingency planning on our side for a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan, highlighting what we're planning to do in some general sense would decrease the potential for a catastrophic Chinese miscalculation, and also demonstrate that Japan and the US mean business when it comes to the defense of Taiwan from PRC aggression. 7th point, Taiwan and Japan should work together to build on progress made in recent years in the bilateral relationship. And this, had I been confirmed as ambassador to Tokyo, I would have focused on this. Alas, the Biden administration, I think, has done the right thing in bringing up the notion of a Japan-Taiwan Relations Act, which would strengthen the de facto diplomatic relations between Japan and Taiwan and promote economic and cultural exchange, bring the two countries closer together. 8th point, although direct military interaction is precluded, Taiwan and Japan could enhance intelligence sharing either through the US or via a regional forum. Taiwan's intelligence would know well in advance if a Chinese invasion were imminent, but Taiwan needs to have a manner to share these such information via secure channels along with any PRC plans it may have obtained, so both the US and Japan can begin a joint defensive mission as soon as possible. My 10th and concluding point or concluding notes, look, I think the last few years, I'm definitely on the transformation side of the relationship here with Shayla and those on that side. The last few years have been absolutely transformative in terms of the Japan-Taiwan trilateral relationship and the broader bilateral relationship and the broader trilateral relationship. Taiwan is no longer a pariah nation. The days when a Japanese prime minister had to go out of his way to avoid any contact with his Taiwanese counterparts is gone. You had the wonderful dinner that Joe Young, the American charge in Tokyo, hosted with Sana Urasan, who's Prime Minister Suga's special advisor on Taipei issues, and with Frank Shea, the Taiwan's representative in Tokyo. Very important, very critical. We've got now, as mentioned earlier, Raymond Green, who is the deputy director of AIT, going to Tokyo and will eventually be the charge in Tokyo. These are important moments in this trilateral relationship. And we're also seeing the Japanese speaking openly about Taiwan's role in such organizations as the World Health Assembly. We've seen working with Taiwan's diplomatic allies as part and parcel of Japan's economic development strategy, as it is part and parcel of ours. And we've obviously seen now the linkage between peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits and Japan's own national security a given. We obviously need to broaden this given the new hub and spokes approach that we are taking to security in the Indo-Pacific. We're engaging more of our allies and partners with Taipei in some manner. The Australian developments are quite welcomed, and I'm sure others will be shortly. Looking forward to the impact of the Taiwan Project Team report that LDP group has released, which is going to strengthen relations further, as was mentioned. But I think now is really the time for us to figure out a way to build on security cooperation in a greatly enhanced bilateral and trilateral context. And here, I think we ought to start thinking about ways that we can have sort of informal meetings, maybe a congressional U.S. Congress, Japanese Diet, legislative yuan trilateral. It can even be virtual, just to sort of to deepen the ties, to figure out ways to bring officials together from the three nations, hoping in some point that we will eventually get the three national security advisors together in a very classified way, I should note, given the sensitivities here. It's all very important. Look, there have been a long history of bilateral exchanges between retired senior Japanese and Taiwanese military leaders, which have allowed for shared discussions of security concerns. But I think for the security of both Taiwan and Japan, and also the United States, it's time to figure out a new mechanism, one involving the U.S., arguably as an intermediary that goes beyond these retired military leaders chatting at the university and think tank sessions, to build deeper camaraderie and prepare for the common defense together. Thank you.
Ken, I can't think of a better way to wrap up our conversation or the presentations than with the remarks that you just gave. That were succinct, forward-looking, and providing really a vision for the future of U.S.-Taiwan-Japan relations, which is precisely what I wanted you to talk about. And now, really recognizing the time constraints here that we have, with only about 23 minutes remaining of our allotted time, I want to remind again our audience members that we will take questions from the audience. So please do submit your questions to contact@globaltaiwan.org, or use the YouTube function, chat function on our YouTube page, and or tweet us at globaltaiwan.org. Now, while we collect those questions, I do have a few questions of my own that I like to address to the panelists, and then I'll turn it to the audience questions when we start, when we get those. So actually, the first question that I have, and this is perhaps directed more towards Yasuhiro and Shayla, but I welcome the other panelists to also address this, is that we constantly hear about the legal obstacles that Japan has to enhancing its security ties with Taiwan. At times, it seems almost sort of insurmountable. Is this really legal, or is it political? So the question here for Yasuhiro and Shayla to address that question, please.
Okay, yeah, this is basically a legal question. So the Japanese government officials, especially defense officials, cannot share their sensitive information to others, including foreign government officials or Taiwanese government officials, without any authorization. So there should be an institutional authorization with a backup of a kind of a bilateral agreement. In Japan-Korea's case, when there was no mutual agreement on military information, which is called GSOMIA, Japan and South Korea's military couldn't exchange their military related intelligence directly. They did that through the United States. Japan and South Korea are neighbors, but they couldn't do so. Can you imagine that, the Japanese defense officers can share the sensitive information or with anyone without any authorization? So this is a, purely legal, obstacle. And Japan and Taiwan have no diplomatic relations. So there is no way to conclude the military intelligence exchange agreement. I can't believe that exchange association and also its counterpart, those are non-governmental quote unquote organizations, they can conclude such kind of agreements. So it's a very big problem if both sides want to promote defense, actually hardcore defense cooperation. Yeah, thank you.
Sheila, do you have any comments?
Sure, Russell, thank you. If I may just briefly, because I think Matsuda-san answered your question, but there is the domestic legal constraints. And I would say not only in relationship to intelligence sharing, but also in terms of how we think about how the United States and Japan might move forward with contingency planning. You're going to run into the limitations of the interpretation of Article 9. And that will be deeply embroiled in the diplomatic constraints that Matsuda Sensei also mentioned. One thing here about the contingency planning, because if that's where we're headed and a defense cooperation guidelines review is in the works, that is a mechanism for US-Japan discussion of the type that Ken was referring to, which is what does a contingency look like? What kind of role might we want or expect from the United States to Japan, the SDF to play or not play? That gets us into the kinds of, past evolution of that conversation. June referred to this as well in her remarks. So I think it gives our military planners and defense officials on the US and Japanese sides the forum with which to discuss the kind of contingency operational coordination that you might envision in a Taiwan contingency, but it does not address the political and legal constraints of what Japan is ready to and able to do. And in other words, what can the SDF do? Probably not combat, right? We're not headed there that fast. But there's an awful lot, I would imagine, that US bases in Japan could benefit from. And this is the same kind of conversation we've had for the Korean contingency as well. And that is a certain amount that the self-defense forces can do under the name of the defense of Japan that would be very useful in a contingency, very proximate, right, to those southern islands of Japan's. So you've got political factors, Russell, and how does the alliance take this into the more public domain to get Japanese support, writ large public support? Then there's the legal constraints on when and how SDF can use force and for what purpose. And right now, Article 9's interpretation is largely to allow for support for certain operations of the United States and other partners that are necessary for the defense or the security of Japan. So that's a very elastic understanding. But there is absolutely no limitations on what the SDF could do for defense of Japan operations. So that's the way our military coordination has legally been parsed out a little bit. So that discussion between the United States and Japan would have to take that into account as well.
June, I think you had a comment as well.
Yeah, I would caution against drawing a hard line between politics and legal. If the politics are right, you change the law. And I would, such as, for example, sanctions. A country is behaving badly, you change the law, and certain goods may no longer be exchanged. And Japan has shown that it can be very, very creative when it wants to. And for example, the fisheries agreement, which I think was 2013, the fisheries agreement between Taiwan and Japan how did they get around that? It was between the fisheries associations of Taiwan and Japan. And so you could make arrangements. Another example I can think of is that this Taiwan US-Japan Global Cooperation Organization. This is said to be administered by the United States, Taiwan, and the Japan-Taiwan Exchange Organization. So there is a lot of room for creativity here, and the Japanese government has been really good at finding it when it wants to, and it can arrange for military exchanges in similar ways. Thank you.
Thank you all for that. And I wanted to pick up on the Taiwan contingency question here and pose this to the entire panel, but I think Shayla and Yoshihide probably would have some additional thoughts on this. And some scholars in Japan have noted that the so-called New Taiwan Clause is an issue that ought to be considered based on Article 5 of the Japan-U.S. Security Treaty, which is about bilateral cooperation in the event of a Japanese emergency, rather than Article 6. What is the significance of this distinction? Is this a distinction that's significant? Do you have any comments on that? Perhaps Yasuhiro or Shayla?
Clause 5 of the US-Japan Security Treaty is related to defense of Japan. And Clause 6 is regional peace and security. So basically, if Taiwan contingency, So if the Taiwan contingency is limited inside the Taiwan contingency, not include, for example, attack against Okinawa or attack against other U.S. bases on Japanese soil, I think that's I think that Article 6, not 5. There is a distinction. But if the Taiwan contingency enlarges and if China attacks U.S. bases on Japanese soil, it becomes a matter of Article 5. It directly becomes a Japan contingency. So SDF can fight back against China. So this is a highly hypothetical issue, but there is a distinction, yes.
So our prior response to you, Russell, was about Japanese legal constraints and the possibility of Japanese self-defense force and other kind of action. Your question about Article 5 and Article 6 also has a precedent that's important to understand, and that is the contingency that the US and Japan have always prepared for, no matter when in the post-war period you're looking at, possibly after 65, right, when the normalization between Japan and Korea happened. It's always been a Korean peninsular contingency, right? So we've done that. We've gotten through the hoops and the hurdles of what's Article 5 versus what's Article 6, right? What role we would expect. And of course, our military uniformed forces have had, classified discussions and exercises, et cetera. And it's kept up with pace with the threat emanating from the Korean Peninsula. The pattern for the security treaty would be the same. And you would be looking at two pieces, not just what's Article 5 and Article 6, but the scenario planning, the tabletop, the contingency dialogue that Ken and others and June have referred to would have to take place to see what U.S. expectations could be, right? Because it's pretty obvious that we also don't have Article 5 protections for Taiwan, right? The United States is also having to consider this full-on event of a PLA attack on Taiwan or some kind of military contingency in a formalized way, right? This is new territory for both the United States as well as Japan. And but I think what you also want to understand is not just what's Article 5 and Article 6. Of course, the bases will be there. What's part of the Korean contingency history is the two officials, communities on both sides, the US and Japanese, got to say, well, what would change if, right, war broke out? What would need to happen? What would US forces stationed in Japan need to do on the Korean Peninsula and therefore need Japanese support for? But also, what would the Japanese government permit to happen from their territory? And so there's an understanding, there's a prior consultation mechanism that attends the treaty, where if we were to change combat operations from Japanese bases or US bases on Japan, if we were to move significantly different weapon systems through Japan for combat, if we were going to change the constellation of our forces in a significant way stationed on Japan, that would require the prior consultation of the government of Japan. So the behind the scenes, this contingency planning is not just an automatic, what's Article 5, Article 6, but it's a much deeper consultative process about how the alliance would kick into gear and what the Japanese government would allow to happen within their sovereign territory. That kind of conversation has not been formalized for a Taiwan contingency for obvious reasons. We haven't planned in that way. So the treaty does kick in, but it'll kick in a way that I think the precedent of the Korean Peninsula might be interesting to look at in terms of what's allowable for the Japanese government, a democratically elected government, right? And what is the role of the Japanese military, the operational role. So you've got two pieces here where I think the security treaty would be important.
That's fascinating. Itong, I think you had your hand raised. You have your hand raised.
Yeah, I was trying to refer to the earlier questions regarding the legal political, but I also like to just comment. Yeah, the first thing, I think the legal, I pretty much agree with Shelia that basically that's illegal in terms of how Japan Constitution itself. And because you look at the lack of diplomatic relation between Taiwan and Japan, but it doesn't stop the Taiwan and Japan from concluding several governmental-like agreements, whether that's investment, free trade agreement. Even we have the more or less like a Japan-Taiwan maritime dialogue, which is similar to the strategic maritime dialogue. So I think just as the Jim said, the Japanese government is very creative in terms of how to find the leeway if they really want to get something done. So I do not think that the lack of diplomatic relation could be that much an obstacle. And if there's anything about legal constraints, that definitely will come from the constitution itself from Japan. And then in this conversation, I think when the Japan involved in the Taiwan scenarios, we basically believe that the Japan won't be able to directly through the coming on its own. It will be always come as a part of the US-Japan alliances. And then from that, then there will be a lot of different scenarios. And those needs to be discussed further because there are a lot of ways Japan can play according to the rules and mission assignment of the US-Japan alliance that Japan can do without even firing a shot or even appearing as they are in the front line of the operations. For example, when we look at the recent Chinese military harassment against Taiwan, apparently they are right now in the last 2.5 years. They come from the Bashi Strait and then to the east of Taiwan, try to encircle Taiwan. But also there's a route on the northeast side, and which basically will pass through the Miyako Straits. And what happened if Japan at that time has its military-like presence just right there, just to monitor or at least play a certain deterrence effect about monitoring or the watching what the Chinese naval activity during at that areas, then that could play to a certain the issue about how the defense of Taiwan will be without even appearing like they are in the naval operations. So that really depends on how the scenario is playing along. But it's not just about the US-Japan. There are also another player that Australia could also come into play. That is in the South China Sea. Because we do know that attack on Taiwan definitely will involve in the warfare in the South China Sea because they wanted to stop Taiwan about the important energy and other supplies into Taiwan. So that's part of blockade operations. And at that time, that the U.S. ally and other allies will play a very significant role in terms of how to face that kind of the situations. So I think it really depends on how the detailed discussion will be. And then for that, I think that will go to the question about the strategic ambiguity, which to a certain extent that the ambiguity about defending Taiwan or lack of, or that lead up to the lack of discussion between the U.S. and other partners in terms of how the Taiwan Strait scenario will be, sometimes will lead to another ambiguity of allied partners, because they do not know how to expect from the United States. So that's another area of how the strategic ambiguity play out in wider strategic calculation and discussion involving other partners. And I think right now it seems that the situation is driving toward more of the clarity without really renouncing the concept of strategic ambiguity. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that intervention, Izong. I want to pick up on the point that that Shayla had raised, and also I think from Yasuhiro and Ken, as well as June. Just I think a stream of on the consultative process here. And I want to make a quick shout out to Adam Liff, who's an associate professor at Indiana University, who had actually recently authored a pretty good paper, I thought, from the Wilson Center, that I think in his recommendation provided several good recommendations that I think really that we hammered in here and from the panel. And I would just spotlight a couple of them. And one is that is to significantly expand funding to support bilateral, trilateral, Track 1.5 and Track 2 dialogues, as well as scholarly academic student exchanges, especially among the United States, Japan, and Taiwan. And so on this point, I would just add that GTI would be happy to host such programs should the State Department decide to ever increase funding for such an initiative. So to any friends who might be watching from the State Department here. But I think to the more substantive point, he also recommended that to launch parallel comprehensive interagency reviews of Taiwan policy as part of a more general review of regional strategy aimed at championing a positive vision. And I think most importantly here, consult and coordinate with each other informally. So I thought that was really to the point of, I think, many of the issues that we talked about and recommendations that were suggested in our conversation. I want to turn it now over to an audience question that we received from Eleanor Hughes from Georgetown University's Asia Studies program. And she asked, and to no one in particular, but she references June here. As June mentioned, Taiwan and Japan were able to put a fisheries agreement into ink back in 2013. In light of the recent Coast Guard law that China implemented back in February, is there room for Taiwan and Japan on a bilateral level, or Taiwan, Japan, and the US on a trilateral level, respectively, to enhance maritime cooperation in light of China's increasing encroachments in the South and East China Seas? No one in particular, but if anyone would like to take that question, I think there's probably a lot to talk about in there. June, do you want to maybe kick off and have the others chime in?
That's a really good question, Eleanor. I have been advocating for some time now that Japan and the United States have joint Coast Guard operations around the Senkaku. And so far, I get I've talked to military officers about this, and you get kind of, oh, that's a really good idea, and that's the end of the conversation. But why not? And would you need specific authorization for it? Does anybody know? Surely it could just happen. Lots of things just happen. What do you think?
Yasuhiro, do you have a comment on that in terms of maritime cooperation among the Coast Guards?
I think that it depends on the definition of maritime cooperation. If the private citizens cooperate each other on maritime environment, I think that it's already going on. So maybe the person who asked this question was to ask about the Coast Guard cooperation, right? Or even the naval cooperation. I think that the answer is no. I think that it's impossible to imagine because both sides have no agreement at all. And there is no way to make agreement on this issue. So the answer is clear.
To be clear, I think the question was referring to Coast Guard law, although it didn't it didn't specify Coast Guard cooperation solely among the Coast Guards or the navies. I think I think the question asked on both levels, but I think your response is that both Coast Guard level and Navy level would not be possible. Is that your response?
Japan, Taiwan, right?
Bilateral and trilateral. Yeah.
Trilateral, bilateral and trilateral, both no. You know, we can't imagine that. You know, only US-Japan and US-Taiwan, unimaginable. And other two, you know, Japan-Taiwan or trilateral are.
And that is without legal, your point is that without legal authorization first within Japan to enable cooperation among Japan and Taiwan, correct?
This kind of thing never just happens, never. So there should be a planning, there should be an agreement, authorization, planning, communications, and everything should be done. Otherwise, there will be an accident. Okay, so you know, we know those military and paramilitary operations very well, and it's not that easy. And there is no mechanism to make the Japan-Taiwan maritime cooperation in terms of Coast Guard and naval operations. No mechanism.
One comment, and that is this whole issue of who owns the Senkaku would come up if Taiwan comes into the picture, because there is a segment of opinion on Taiwan that those islands belong to Taiwan.
Shayla, you had a comment that you wanted to make?
Sure. Hi, Eleanor. Eleanor is a former student of mine, so I am delighted to see her asking questions. Let me just say one thing, Eleanor, that's important to understand, and I think in particular Matsuda-san's comment is really to say that there is no state-to-state relationship between Taiwan and Japan. Therefore, there can't be a Coast Guard agreement, not a formal one, at least. And so coordinating state agencies, be they Coast Guards or militaries, requires a diplomatic relationship, right? So without that, that becomes a little problematic in terms of formalized agreements. However, one of the things I would direct, if you're interested in the Coast Guard piece, especially the Chinese Coast Guard law and US-Japan response to it, I'll let our Taiwanese colleagues speak on the Taiwanese interpretation of it, but the US Coast Guard has increased its presence in the Western Pacific. There's the Coast Guard Defense Attaché in Canberra down in Australia. The Coast Guard has sent ships, fast cutters to Palau. We were talking about the cable project in Palau, right? The other day I was looking this up and as we were all talking, and now my phone won't recognize my face. Okay, in 2019, the USS Coast Guard cutter Bertholf, I don't know the name of that, but anyway, it went through the Taiwan Straits. So if you watch and track American Coast Guard behavior, you'll see that there's much more integration or teaming up, I guess is the better word, with the US Navy and the Pacific Fleet. And in a way to demonstrate American Coast Guard presence and give America more flexible options to deal with the Chinese presence. But the real trick of the Chinese Coast Guard law, and I'd love a Taiwanese, our colleague to respond to this, because the Chinese Coast Guard law now says the Chinese Coast Guard can use force to assert sovereignty. That's the trigger that the Japanese government has responded to, because of course, what does that mean? They get to shoot at vessels in and around the Senkakus, or they get to shoot at any vessel they want to in the South China Sea. Is that really what that law is intended to do? But that blurs the line then between what we think of as white hulls and gray hulls. Law enforcement, Coast Guards, and militaries, right? Which again, I may be overinterpreting Matsuda-san, but some of the distress I could hear in your voice about causing accidents and escalating tensions is also because the Coast Guard military lines are getting blurred by Chinese accelerated deployment of large and lethal ships, by the allowance in this new law of use of force by the Coast Guard in ways that are not internationally recognized as appropriate, and because it's a more crowded space. So I'm sure from the vantage point of Taipei, this is also very worrisome, but I'm not sure that trilateral Coast Guard cooperation is the right response. But let me just leave that there for our Taiwanese colleagues to.
Itom, I want to give you the last word here. So we've run out of time, but I want you to have a chance to respond and offer some final thoughts.
Yeah, regarding the Coast Guard, Chinese Coast Guard law, that definitely that we hear a lot from many of the private and the public conversation, but from our Japan friends that they public voice very much worrisome about this development and how that could cause the conflict between China and its neighbor, especially with Japan or other, even in Southeast Asian countries in the South China Sea. And I think the worry definitely is right, and China wanted to give the Coast Guard the kind of the authority, and also to a certain extent force them to respond forcefully about the some of the situations. Should they consider that they wanted to respond? And in Taiwan, I think right now what China is doing already, they escalate into the military realm. So they do not really need the Coast Guard law to really try to uphold something. Just like yesterday, the 28 jets, 15 in the morning and 13 in the afternoon. Some of them, they are venturing into even to the east coast of Taiwan. So we saw those already, many of those already, and there are also many of the Chinese naval ship intrusion, which we never publicized, but the number is definitely increasing. Yeah, so Taiwan is facing a different kind of issues. We are way beyond the so-called Coast Guard law. But on the other hand, I think regarding Coast Guard cooperation, we do see that they're increasing the U.S. and Taiwan on this. So as the year 2019, we see more and more U.S. Coast Guard presence in the waters surrounding Taiwan. But on the other hand, that the Taiwan-Japan, yes, the lack of diplomatic relations did face some obstacles, but if we continue in this, then probably the only Coast Guard Taiwan and Japan will come up with will be the repetition like year 2010 to year 2012 during Mount Joe's time, where the Taiwan and Japan Coast Guard are shooting water cannon against each other. So I think that basically highlights the need for the conversation or some kind of the operandi to manage these issues.
On that note here, unfortunately, we have exhausted all the time that we have, but I know we could have gone on for hours longer, but also in consideration of the time in Asia for our guests from Japan and Taiwan, we'll unfortunately have to bring today's session to a close. And so I want to thank again our panelists from the United States and across the Indo-Pacific as well. And also all our online viewers for joining in today's discussion. So until next time, stay safe and stay healthy. Take care, everybody.